We want to turn now to just the story that I think is hanging over us every day. That's the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the broader attempts to break the back of the Palestinian people, and of course the fact that the Palestinian people refuse to be broken, and the people of the world are rising up in massive, unprecedented numbers, many say, in solidarity with them. So to get into everything swirling around this, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Yara Shufani, who is a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Yara, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, great to have you here. I want to start with the, I guess I should use air quotes, peace plan that's been presented by Donald Trump here, 21 points that I guess have been edited also by Netanyahu. So maybe we should call it the Trump-Netanyahu plan. But, obviously for many people who are seeing the genocide, Yara, people want to see things stop. So I think there are many people who are probably thinking, oh, great, there's a peace plan. Maybe this could happen. So what is the substance of this, and how should people be thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good that you use the air quotes there, Eugene, and also called it the Trump-Netanyahu peace plan. I think that's really accurate. And I think the best way to understand this plan is that it's not actually a peace plan. It's not actually a plan that's interested in any kind of ceasefire resolution or ending the genocide, but actually what this is a ploy designed by Trump and Netanyahu together as a way to counter Israel's isolation on a world scale, and as a way to put conditions or sort of put a set of choices in front of Hamas where it's sort of a lose-lose situation really for the Palestinian people. And what I mean by that is that over the course of the last few months, especially, we've seen a major escalation in terms of people's dissatisfaction with this war at a mass scale, including all across the United States, including within Trump's own base, segments of Trump's mega movement really starting to be really critical of Israel. Most recently, we saw European nations in a very flawed, but nonetheless, interesting kind of attempt, go against the United States in asserting that they will be recognizing a Palestinian state. And so really, the U.S. and Israel have been starting to become increasingly isolated on a world scale. And this plan is an attempt to turn the tables and actually create a situation where if Hamas accepts the plan, we're looking at an effective surrender on many levels, and we can get into the details of why that is. And then, of course, if Hamas declines the plan, then the United States and Israel will be able to re-galvanize support for Israel's ongoing genocide. And I think it's important to say that Netanyahu said this himself. So the day after his White House meeting, he had an interview where he spoke in Hebrew to a Hebrew audience, where he basically says word for word that Israel was isolated. That when he came to the United States, Israel was isolated, and he says, I quote, "Instead of Hamas isolating us, we turned the tables and isolated Hamas. Now the entire world, including the Arab and Muslim world, is pressuring Hamas to release the hostages, all while the IDF remains in most of the Gaza Strip." And so I think Netanyahu is being really clear here. This is a plan where Hamas's acceptance will give Israel the ability to, say that the Palestinians have surrendered and set a set of conditions that are extremely unfavorable for the Palestinian people. And then on the flip side, if Hamas declines on the premise that this would be catastrophic for the Palestinian people, then we would see an attempt to kind of frame Hamas as the block or sort of the barrier to peace, despite the reality that we're on 2 years of a genocide where Israel has killed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, expanded its war into the broader region, just last month assassinated or, killed negotiators that were trying to assess one of Trump's last plans. And so, they're looking for a way to actually reframe who the barrier to peace is.
Mm-hmm. No, I think is a great framing, and it's talk more about what acceptance would really mean in this context. And obviously, it's a real tough reality, I think, in terms of either side of this. But I said to someone when I saw the Trump 21-point plan, I said, it reminds me of the Belgian Congo, with Trump as the king, Blair as the governor, and this so-called security force as the force publique. And it's stunning, honestly, and even calling it a peace plan. But, if there is an acceptance, I mean, what does that mean in terms of the context for what's going to happen in Gaza and for Palestinians more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, look, the details of the plan are, really nefarious on multiple levels, right? We see the plan really tie concretely the question of aid and the ability of aid to enter, and tied with demilitarization and surrender, right? And so while the plan kind of positions itself as saying, look, we're going to allow 600, if this plan is accepted, we'll allow 600 trucks to enter a day, equipment, to remove rubble and so on. And it'll be the United Nations administering that. Ultimately, what we actually know is that is going to be tied to surrender and demilitarization. And so only in areas that become effectively demilitarized, where, we see the Hamas surrender and there's a complete demilitarization, would have access to this kind of aid. And so effectively what, the United States is saying is that after a 2-year-long war where Israel has shown itself to be a genocidal entity, it is the Palestinian people who must, lay down their arms and commit to not only, to essentially commit to not even having defensive capabilities. And that this is what aid is conditional upon. The plan is structured into 3 phases, where within the first phase, within 72 hours of accepting the plan, Hamas would be required to release all of the hostages that are being held, both the alive and deceased hostages, and that in turn Israel would release 1,700 Palestinians who have been held hostage by Israel since the October 7th, 2023, and up to 250 Palestinian prisoners who are being detained and held with life sentences. And so this is within the first phase of the plan. But then as you move into the second phase of the plan, what you actually see is there's sort of a mapping. So, phase 1 follows a certain kind of map. Phase 2, Trump has crafted maps as Western nations love to do when it comes to the Arab region and much of the global South. And so, crafted these maps where essentially Israel would be allowed to stay in Gaza, a continued encirclement of Gaza, and would allow for Israeli soldiers to remain in the Philadelphia corridor, which is Gaza's border with Egypt, and Gaza's really only border with the outside world. And they would stay in these areas until an international force is set up. And this would be, a combination of American and Arab nations that are, force. I think they may be using language here of peacekeepers, but I don't necessarily want to use this language, who would then, be stationed and play the role of enforcing to ensure that demilitarization is taking place. And only once that happens, would there be, an entrance into phase 3. And you mentioned something really important, Eugene, you talked about Tony Blair and so on. And this is a central part of this plan as well, which is the setting up of a transitional government. And I think Trump used the language of a board of peace, where, it would be chaired by Donald Trump, and other members would include heads of state, including former Prime Minister Tony Blair. This is a technocratic board that would really oversee the administration of Gaza, which would at the center of it have Tony Blair, a war criminal who led the invasion of Iraq, which murdered over 1 million Iraqis, whose institute major donor is Larry Ellison of Oracle. This is the same Larry Ellison who's now acquired TikTok, in what is widely understood as being, a huge benefit to Israel. And this is a major donor for Tony Blair's, institute. And so we're talking here about an arrangement that involves people like Jared Kushner, involved in the administering of Gaza, Donald Trump, Tony Blair, really like a plan that would really restructure Gaza and allow for these major figures within the American political terrain, who stand a lot to benefit from development and exploitation and extractive economies and so on, giving them a central role in the administration of the Gaza Strip. So this is a plan that has nothing really to do with the Palestinian people. It's no surprise that no Palestinians were involved in the drafting of this plan. This was drafted, collaboratively between Trump and Netanyahu, despite attempts by some liberal kind of commentators to suggest that Netanyahu is mad about this plan. I think it's clear that he's not. And that really there were no Palestinians involved in the drafting of this plan because it has nothing really to do with Palestinian self-determination or freedom.
I'm glad you made the point about Netanyahu saying that they're isolating people, because certainly we've seen the rising tide of solidarity with Palestine only continue to grow around the context of the global Samud flotilla, which has unleashed a new wave of protest around the world in addition to everything else. I mean, talk about the significance of the flotilla and some of what's coming from it, because I think it has in some ways really kind of, I don't want to say reignited as if it went away, but you can see, whether we're talking about Italy or wherever, the movement in solidarity with Palestine has really been lifted by those who have been willing to risk so much by going on this flotilla, which now I believe has been overtaken by the Israelis, and those who are on there are in custody, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I believe the ships were all detained just last night and some early this morning. I mean, one I think actually made its way into Gaza waters for the first time, and we were talking here about a 50 civilian ships, 400 people that made the trek from all across the world in an attempt to break the siege on Gaza, a siege that has been ongoing for over 19 years and that has effectively turned Gaza into an open-air prison, which is particularly detrimental in the course of this genocide. But even before this genocide began, really the siege has been responsible for mass destruction and death and starvation in Gaza. And so I think the escalation of the flotillas, right? What started off with one flotilla and now is growing into a movement of people around the world that are determined to break the siege on Gaza, to get aid to Gaza, and to stand with the Palestinian people, is in such a stark contrast to what we're seeing, leaders of the quote unquote free world do, right, and say, and while they send weapons, countries like the United States and Canada and Britain and so on have all these weapons contracts with Israel. The people of the world are trying to get aid into Gaza, right? And I think that just shows so concretely, when we say that the world stands with the Palestinian people, this is, I think, a really, really clear example of that you have activists and regular people who are risking everything to get on these flotillas and try to break the siege. And it has a significance in the sense that not only does it show the way in which the world stands with Gaza, not only is it such a critical act of defiance against the powers at be, the large Western powers that are isolating Gaza from the world, but I think it also really speaks to just the inevitability of the siege, of the breaking of the siege. Like the siege, the siege, which has been for so many Palestinians, like any Palestinian under the age of 19, the siege is all they've known. The blockade is all they've known. And I think that so many of us, even growing up, like in our collective memories, Gaza has been under siege, and the flotillas really represent a determination by the people of the world that the siege is not going to be a permanent siege. And, I think even just to sort of tie it to the peace plan, like Trump's proposed 20-point peace plan, is that, Israel and the United States are putting forward a plan as if they are interested in getting aid into Gaza. But then just 24 hours later are detaining and seizing, 400 people who are trying to get aid into Gaza, right? Because that aid that the Samud flotillas are trying to get in is, of course, not conditional on the disarmament of the Palestinian people or their surrender or their capitulation, but is based in the principles of freedom and self-determination, right? And so I do think that the movement that we're seeing in terms of people all across the world taking on a variety of tactics and trying to do all that they can in order to end this genocide is a reflection of the conviction that the movement and that Palestine has instilled in the broader movement and in the hearts and minds of people. And I just no matter how many no matter how much visits to the United States Netanyahu does, no matter how much they pay TikTok influencers, to spew Israeli propaganda, Zionist propaganda. Ultimately, I think that what we've seen in terms of a mass movement over the last few years, and what the flotillas in particular represent, show us that all of these efforts to control the narrative and to win people back over to Israel's side are going to be futile, because people's lives have really changed forever in terms of their support and conviction for the Palestinian people.
No, it seems to be very much the case. And from the flotilla to the People's Arms embargo, we're seeing all sorts of interesting and exciting types of protest emerge to address this genocide, which millions and millions do not want to see done in their name. Well, we really appreciate you, as always, Yara, helping us sort through it all. Yara Shafani from the Palestinian Youth Movement, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me on.